Selah Winters was 34 years old, and by the first hard frost of 1887, she owned nothing but the boots on her feet and $23 sewn into the hem of her only good skirt. It was her late husband's brother, Ambrose Winters, who put her out of the house on Coulter's Ridge, Montana Territory, the house she had scrubbed and mended and warmed with her own hands for 9 years, declaring, with the county clerk standing witness, that the land and the timber and the good stone well belonged to him now, by a paper Selah had never been shown and never been asked to sign. She left with a trunk, a shawl, and the small hard coins that were, by that point, the entire remaining evidence that she had ever had a life at all. With that little, in the gray hush before the season's first true blizzard, she paid every last cent of it. All $23, for a forgotten, half-collapsed root cellar dug into the hillside above Widow's Draw, a hole in the earth that the town considered worthless, maybe even cursed, and that no one else in Coulter's Ridge would have touched with a 10-foot pole. It seemed, to anyone watching, the last desperate act of a woman with nothing left to lose. But sealed behind the cellar's crumbling far wall was something that had waited in the dark for almost 30 years, something that, when the snow finally came down hard enough to bury the whole valley, would turn that forgotten hole in the ground into the only warm place for miles, and would end up saving not just Selah, but the entire town that had turned its back on her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Selah Winters. If you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or written off by the people around you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Selah had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised in the eastern hills of Missouri, the third of 5 daughters born to a stonemason named Elias Byrne and his wife Constance, a woman known throughout their small river town for her hands that could coax a garden out of clay soil, that could deliver a breech calf, that could stitch a wound closed as neatly as a Sunday dress. It was Constance who taught Selah the 2 things that would matter most in the years to come: how to read the land and how to keep things. Not merely to store them, but to keep them, to understand that a jar of preserved plums or a bundle of dried yarrow or a sack of good seed corn was not just food or medicine, but a kind of promise, a small act of faith that the person storing it made toward a future they could not yet see. A root cellar is a chapel, Constance used to say, kneeling in the cool dark among the shelves she'd built with her own hands, and everything on these shelves is a prayer you're saying to the person you'll be next winter. Selah had thought it a strange, almost superstitious thing to say as a girl. She understood it fully only much later, when she had nothing left but the memory of her mother's voice and the habits that voice had carved into her. She married Thomas Winters in the spring of 1878, when she was 25, and he was a broad-shouldered carpenter with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, newly arrived in Missouri from Montana Territory to bury his own father and settle the estate. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was an honest one, and he loved Selah with a steadiness that never once wavered in the 9 years they had together. He brought her west to Coulter's Ridge, a mining and cattle town strung along a fast creek at the foot of the Bitterroot foothills, where he built her a house with his own hands, modest but sound, with a good stone foundation and a root cellar dug deep enough to keep through the worst of any Montana winter. Selah filled that cellar the way her mother had taught her: rows of jarred huckleberries and canned venison, braids of onions, sacks of dried beans, bundles of healing herbs hung upside down from the rafters, yarrow for fever, mullein for the lungs, comfrey for broken bones. She became, without ever seeking the title, the woman other wives in Coulter's Ridge came to when a child ran hot with fever in the night or when a husband's cough would not break. She never once refused anyone, and she never once asked for payment beyond what people could spare, which in a town like Coulter's Ridge was often nothing at all. Thomas used to tease her gently that she was building a second house entirely out of kindness, one with no walls, that covered more ground than the one he'd built with lumber and nails. She used to answer that kindness was the only house that never burned down. Neither of them could have known how soon that saying would be tested. Thomas died in the late summer of 1887, crushed beneath a wagon of green timber on a logging road above the draw, and Selah's world did not simply crack. It was taken from her, deliberately, piece by piece, in the weeks that followed. Ambrose Winters, Thomas's younger brother, arrived from Butte within the month, ostensibly to grieve, though Selah noticed almost immediately that his grief seemed to travel everywhere alongside a leather satchel of papers. Ambrose was a man who had always resented that Thomas, the elder son, had inherited their father's good name and steady hands while he himself had inherited only their father's taste for cards and quick money. He produced, before Thomas's grave had even properly settled, a deed amendment supposedly signed by Thomas the previous winter, transferring the house and land to Ambrose in the event of Thomas's death, in exchange for a debt Thomas had allegedly owed him. Selah had never once heard her husband speak of any such debt, and the signature on the paper looked, to her eye, subtly wrong. Too careful, too practiced, nothing like the quick, confident hand Thomas used on his carpentry orders. But she was a widow with no living kin nearby, no money for a lawyer, and a county clerk in Josiah Crane, Coulter's Ridge's most prominent banker and land agent, and, as it happened, a close business associate of Ambrose's, who ruled the paper valid without so much as reading it twice. Within 6 weeks of burying her husband, Selah Winters was standing on the road outside the house she had built with her own 2 hands, watching Ambrose Winters nail a fresh coat of paint over a doorframe she had painted herself, with $23 in her pocket and absolutely nowhere in the world that was hers. She did not weep on that road, though she wanted to. She had learned, from her mother's hands and her mother's chapel of a cellar, that grief was a thing you carried while you kept moving, not a thing you set down and stayed beside. She took a room for 2 nights at the boarding house run by a kind, tired widow named Opal Finn, who fed her broth without asking payment and who mentioned, almost in passing, that old Ruth Abernathy's place up at Widow's Draw was finally going up for sale at auction. What was left of it, anyway, since the cabin had burned some 15 years back, and all that remained standing was the root cellar dug into the hillside, boarded shut and mostly forgotten. Nobody wanted it. Ruth Abernathy had been a strange, solitary woman, a healer and midwife of sorts who had lived alone at the edge of town for decades before she vanished. Some said she'd frozen to death out on the mountain one bad winter and was never found. Others whispered she'd simply walked off one day and never come back. And in the years since, children dared each other to run up to the cellar door and back without looking inside. It was considered, Opal said with an apologetic little laugh, thoroughly bad luck. The county was selling it for whatever it could get, just to close the estate and be done with it. Selah went to look at it the next morning, more out of habit than hope, her mother's habit of always assessing a piece of ground for what it might still give. She walked up the frozen ruts of Widow's Draw Road with her shawl pulled tight against a wind that already smelled of snow, and she found the cellar exactly as Opal had described, a low mound built into the hillside, its planked door gray and swollen with age, chained shut with a rusted padlock that had long since given up any real claim to security. She stood before it a long moment. She thought of her mother's voice, a chapel, a promise, a prayer to the person you'll be next winter. And something in her, some stubborn ember she hadn't known was still burning, told her that a person with nothing had very little to lose in owning a hole in a hillside that at least, unlike everything else that had been taken from her, could not be signed away by anyone's crooked pen. The county auctioneer, a thin, harried man eager to be finished before the weather turned, took her $23 without so much as raising an eyebrow, and by that same afternoon, Selah Winters was the sole legal owner of Ruth Abernathy's abandoned root cellar, and nothing else on God's earth besides. She broke the padlock herself with a stone, because she had not 1 cent left for a locksmith, and she pulled the swollen door open against a groan of hinges that had not turned in 15 years. Cold, still air rolled out to meet her, carrying the dry, mineral smell of old earth and something else beneath it, something faintly sweet, like dried apples, that seemed impossible after so many years of abandonment. She had to duck her head to enter, and once inside, in the gray light leaking through the door, she found the cellar larger than it had appeared from without, dug deep and shored with hand-hewn timbers, the walls lined with the collapsed remnants of wooden shelving, most of it rotted through, jars shattered by decades of freeze and thaw. It was, by every reasonable measure, a ruin. But as her eyes adjusted, Selah noticed 2 things that struck her as strange. The first was that the air inside was not nearly as cold as it should have been. Given the season and the broken door, there was a faint, persistent warmth rising from somewhere near the back wall, as though the earth itself were breathing gently. The second was that, on a shelf near the entrance that had somehow survived intact, sat a single unbroken jar of preserved apples, its wax seal still whole, and beside it, tucked into a niche in the stone, a small tin box that did not look 15 years old at all. It looked, if anything, deliberately placed, deliberately hidden, and deliberately meant to be found by whoever came looking. Her hands were unsteady as she opened the tin, more from cold and grief than fear, and inside she found not treasure in any ordinary sense, but a folded paper, brittle at the creases, written in a small, careful hand she did not recognize. It began simply, "To whoever finds this cellar and has the sense to look past what it seems to be." Selah sat down right there on the dirt floor, her skirts pooling around her, and read it through twice by the thin gray light of the open door, and by the time she finished, her understanding of the $23 she'd just spent had changed entirely. The letter was from Ruth Abernathy herself, and it told a story that unraveled, layer by layer, everything Coulter's Ridge believed it knew about the strange old healer who had vanished from Widow's Draw. Ruth had not died wandering lost in a blizzard, as the town's gentler rumors claimed, nor had she simply walked away, as the crueler ones suggested. She had left, deliberately and in secret, because she had uncovered something dangerous. In the years before her disappearance, Ruth wrote, she had served as midwife and healer to half the families of Coulter's Ridge, rich and poor alike, and in that role she had come to hold, quietly and without anyone's official notice, a great many of the town's private confidences, including the fact that the bank, then newly under the direction of a sharp young clerk named Josiah Crane's own father, had been systematically forging debt papers against poorer families, particularly widows and homesteaders with no kin to contest them, seizing their land through manufactured obligations and reselling it at a profit to the railroad surveyors who had begun eyeing the valley for a spur line. Ruth had proof, ledgers she had copied in secret from a bank clerk who confided in her out of guilt, names and dates, and forged signatures laid out plain. She had also, and this was the detail that made Selah's breath catch, begun quietly using her own modest savings to buy back, in her own name, small parcels of the seized land before the bank could resell them, intending to hold them in trust until she could find a way to safely expose the fraud and return the land to the families it had been stolen from. But before she could act, she wrote, she had begun to notice she was being watched, and she feared, rightly, as it would turn out, that if the bank ever discovered what she held, she would disappear far more permanently than by simply moving on. So she had built false shelving along the cellar's back wall, sealing behind it her ledger, her land deeds, a store of preserved food and seed corn meant to outlast any single winter. And, she wrote almost as an afterthought, the reason the cellar itself never truly froze, a vein of warm mineral water she had discovered running beneath the hillside, which she had channeled, with considerable effort, into a shallow stone trough beneath the floor, so that even the coldest Montana winter could not fully chill the room above it. She had meant it, she wrote, as insurance, a place that could shelter someone, or something worth protecting, no matter how hard the weather turned against them. She had never come back to retrieve any of it. Whatever became of her, the letter did not say, and Selah understood, with a slow, sorrowful chill, that she likely never would know. It took Selah 3 full days of careful, aching work to pry loose the false shelving Ruth had built into the cellar's back wall, and when she finally broke through, she found the old healer's hidden chamber exactly as described. Dozens of jars of preserved food gone somehow still sound in the cellar's strange steady warmth, sacks of seed corn and dried beans, bundles of medicinal herbs wrapped in oiled cloth, a tin strongbox holding not gold, as a lesser story might have promised, but something far more dangerous and far more valuable to the people of Coulter's Ridge. Ruth Abernathy's copied bank ledgers, 11 land deeds registered quietly in her own name for parcels the bank had fraudulently seized, and a list, in her own careful hand, of every family who had lost land under Josiah Crane's father's forged papers, a list that included, Selah realized with a jolt that stole the breath clean out of her chest, the very same handwriting style, the same particular slant and flourish of the letter S that she had seen on the paper Ambrose Winters had produced to take her own house away. She did not act rashly. Selah understood, from a lifetime spent watching her mother tend fevers that could just as easily be broken too fast as too slow, that a discovery of this size, handled wrong, could be buried again just as easily as it had been unburied, and this time, perhaps, along with her. So through the early days of that hard, closing-in winter, she worked quietly. She moved what little she owned into the cellar itself, grateful beyond words for its strange, persistent warmth, and she told no one in town, not even kind Opal Finn, precisely what she had found, only that she was managing well enough on Ruth Abernathy's old place. She spent long nights by lamplight comparing the forged signature Ambrose had used against her against the samples in Ruth's ledger, cross-referencing names, tracing the pattern of families who had lost land in the years since. The Alders, the Duttons, the Whitfield widow, 12 families in all, stretching back nearly 2 decades, every one of them poor, every one of them without the means or standing to challenge a banker's word against their own. She began, in the privacy of that warm, dark cellar, to draft, slowly, carefully, in her own plain hand, a full accounting of what she had found, meaning to take it not to Josiah Crane, who could simply destroy it, but to the Territorial Land Office in Missoula, where Ruth's original deeds, properly registered under Montana law, might yet be honored regardless of what had happened to the woman who filed them. She might have managed it quietly, too, had word not begun to spread, as word in a small town always does, that the widow Winters was seen going in and out of old Ruth Abernathy's cellar at odd hours, that lamplight glowed there past midnight, that she seemed, against all sense, to be thriving on a piece of ground everyone else considered cursed and worthless. It reached Ambrose Winters first, who mentioned it, uneasily, to his associate Josiah Crane over a hand of cards, and Crane, whose own father since Selah's growing pile of evidence threatened to unearth, did not take the news calmly. He rode up to Widow's Draw himself on a gray afternoon in late November, ostensibly to offer, with an oily sort of neighborly concern, to buy the worthless old cellar off her hands for a token sum, to spare her the trouble of a hard winter out there alone. Selah, standing in the cellar doorway with dirt still on her hands from that morning's work, told him plainly that she had no interest in selling. Crane's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still and very cold, and he told her, in a voice gentle as a closing door, that a woman alone on an isolated piece of ground could find all manner of trouble came the deep snow. Trouble no one in town would likely hear about until it was too late to matter. He left without another word. But Selah understood the shape of the threat well enough, and she understood, too, that she was now working against a clock far shorter than she had hoped. Within a week, the pressure sharpened further. The county assessor, a man beholden to Crane's bank for his own mortgage, arrived to inform Selah, with visible discomfort, that the Abernathy parcel's original sale might have been improperly conducted, and that the county was reviewing whether her purchase was even valid, a maneuver, plainly, meant to strip the land from her before she could act on what she'd found inside it. Meanwhile, Ambrose himself came calling, no longer pretending at grief, warning her in coarse terms to leave well enough alone or find herself with far less than $23 to her name. Selah, for the first time since Thomas's death, felt something crack loose in her chest that was not grief at all, but a hard, clean anger. The recognition that the same forces that had stolen her home had been stealing homes from families across Coulter's Ridge for 20 years, hiding behind respectability and law, and that Ruth Abernathy had died, or vanished, or simply disappeared into the mountain silence. Trying to stop exactly this. She would not, she decided, let that be for nothing. But she was still only one woman, with a stack of old papers, against a banker who owned the county clerk, the assessor, and half the men in town who owed him money. She needed, she realized, something more than proof. She needed a moment when the whole town would be forced to see, plainly and all at once, both what Crane truly was and what her forgotten hillside cellar truly held. She did not have to wait long. The blizzard that had been circling the valley all season finally came down in full on the second night of December, and it came down harder and longer than any storm Coulter's Ridge had seen in a generation. It began as a low moan in the pines above Widow's Draw and became, within hours, a roaring white wall that swallowed the road, the creek, the town itself, dropping temperatures so savagely that by midnight, 3 separate homes in Coulter's Ridge had lost their stoves to burst pipes and smoke-choked flues, and a party of 6 travelers, among them Opal Finn's own visiting sister and her 2 small children, found themselves stranded on the draw road when their wagon axle snapped in a drift knot, 200 yards from Selah's cellar door. It was Selah who heard their shouts carried thin and desperate on the wind, and Selah who went out into that howling dark with a lantern and a length of rope to bring them in, half frozen, stumbling, one child already gone dangerously quiet and still in his mother's arms. She brought all 6 of them down into the cellar, and it was there, in the strange steady warmth rising from Ruth Abernathy's hidden spring, that the frightened, half-frozen child's shivering finally slowed and stopped and gave way, blessedly, to sleep. Word of a warm, dry shelter up at the old Abernathy place spread through Coulter's Ridge that same terrible night, carried by every soul lucky enough to reach it. And by the second day of the blizzard, as the town's ordinary hearths failed one by one under the storm's relentless cold, and the schoolhouse and the church both proved too drafty and too poorly stocked to hold heat for long, nearly 40 men, women, and children had made their way, some carried, some crawling, up the buried road to the one place in the whole valley that never once went cold, the cellar that Coulter's Ridge had once called cursed, now packed shoulder to shoulder with the very people who had considered it worthless. Selah fed them from Ruth Abernathy's preserved stores, jars that had somehow kept sound for 15 years in that strange, even warmth, and she treated the worst of the frostbite and fever with the same yarrow and comfrey her mother had taught her to hang from cellar rafters a lifetime ago. And through 3 full days and nights while the blizzard raged and buried the valley in white, the people of Coulter's Ridge, the same people who had watched Ambrose Winters take her house without a word of protest, the same people whose own kin, she now knew, had lost land to Josiah Crane's forged papers, sat together in the warm dark of Ruth Abernathy's cellar and began, slowly, to understand exactly what they were sitting inside of. It was Opal Finn, sharp-eyed, even half-frozen, who first noticed the ledgers stacked carefully on a shelf near the hidden chamber and asked, plainly, what they were. And Selah, surrounded by nearly the whole surviving town with nowhere left to go and no way for the truth to simply vanish into a locked drawer, finally told them everything. Ruth Abernathy's letter, the forged debts, the 12 stolen homesteads, and the particular slant of the letter S that matched both the old bank ledgers and the paper that had taken her own house from her not 3 months before. The storm broke on the 4th morning, and Coulter's Ridge dug itself out into a world gone white and silent and strangely changed. Josiah Crane, arriving in town from his own snowbound house to find the roads finally passable, discovered within the hour that there was no longer any secret left to protect. 40 witnesses had spent 3 days reading, by lamplight, through evidence of his father's fraud and his own ongoing complicity in it, and among them were the very families, the Alders, the Duttons, old Mrs. Whitfield, and Selah herself, whose stolen land the ledgers named outright. There was no mob, no violence, nothing so crude. Coulter's Ridge was, in the end, a town of practical people, and practical people, once shown the truth plainly enough, tend simply to stop extending trust to the man who lied to them. The Territorial Land Office in Missoula, presented with Ruth Abernathy's properly filed original deeds and her meticulous ledger of forged signatures, moved with unusual speed once a dozen respectable townsfolk arrived to corroborate the claim in person, and within the month, Josiah Crane's bank was placed under territorial investigation, his standing in Coulter's Ridge collapsing not through punishment handed down by any court, but through the far quieter, far more thorough justice of a community that simply, finally, saw him clearly. Ambrose Winters, faced with the same evidence and the very real possibility of standing trial alongside Crane for forgery, chose to sign the house on Coulter's Ridge back over to Selah rather than risk it, slipping out of town before the spring thaw and never showing his face there again. And the 12 families named in Ruth Abernathy's ledger, one by one, found their homesteads quietly restored to them through the land office, their old debts struck from the county record as the frauds they had always been. Selah Winters could have kept Ruth Abernathy's remaining trust land for herself. She had, after all, paid for the cellar honestly, found the deeds through her own labor, and owed the town nothing beyond what she had already given it during 3 days and nights of shared shelter. But she chose, instead, exactly what Ruth Abernathy had intended from the beginning. She used the last of the recovered parcels to establish, right there at Widow's Draw, a proper communal cellar and storehouse, built wide and deep into the same warm hillside, so that no family in Coulter's Ridge would ever again face a hard winter with empty shelves or a cold hearth, and so that the strange, generous warmth Ruth had found running beneath that ground might go on serving the very purpose the old healer had always meant for it, a chapel dug into the earth, a promise kept forward across time to people who would never know the woman who first believed they were worth protecting. And so we come back to where we began, a 34-year-old widow, cast out with nothing, who spent her last $23 on a forgotten hole in a hillside that everyone else in Coulter's Ridge had written off as worthless, maybe even cursed. It would have been easy, looking at Selah Winters in that first terrible week, to see only what she had lost: the house, the husband, the standing, the name. It would have been easy, too, for Selah herself to have taken what she found in Ruth Abernathy's hidden chamber and used it only to secure her own comfort, her own quiet revenge, and no one watching would have blamed her for it. But the truest thing Selah Winters carried out of that cellar was not the ledger, or the deeds, or even the warmth that saved 40 of her neighbors from freezing in the dark. It was the same thing her mother had tried to teach her years before in a Missouri root cellar full of jarred plums and hanging herbs. That keeping things, food, medicine, truth, kindness, is always, in the end, a kind of faith in people you cannot yet see, a bet placed on a future you will not fully live to witness. Ruth Abernathy placed that bet 15 years before Selah Winters was ever cast out onto a frozen road, and could not have known who would find it, or when, or whether it would matter at all. It mattered. It always does, eventually, if you are patient enough, and honest enough, and willing enough to keep the shelves full for the person who comes after you. Thank you for spending this time with Selah's story and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks like nothing can still be holding everything, and that value has a way of surviving even when the people around it forget to look for it. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? A place, an object, even a person? Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.